If you've felt increasingly alert but less capable, more informed but less grounded, clearer about what's wrong but unsure why everything still feels unstable, this book is written for you. Not to reassure you, to explain what you are already sensing. This is not a book about meaning disappearing. It is a book about meaning being reassigned. About work that used to be done quietly by shared structures now landing inside individual lives. About why so many people feel permanently on, morally awake, emotionally strained, and oddly ineffective all at once. Have you noticed that understanding more no longer brings relief? That staying aware feels like a form of labor? That you are expected to carry positions, emotions, and urgencies that never seem to resolve? This book will not argue with those experiences. It will organize them. Chapter 1. The Illusion That Held. There was a time when meaning did not feel fragile. It did not have to be defended, refreshed, or reasserted every day. It existed in the background of life, quiet and unremarkable, like gravity. People did not wake up asking what everything meant. They woke up knowing where they stood, what was expected of them, and what counted as a life well lived. Even when those expectations were unjust, even when they were suffocating, they were stable. Meaning was not something you constructed. It was something you entered. You were born into it. It arrived with language, with ritual, with inherited roles and assumptions that preceded your ability to question them. Long before you could choose, the world had already answered for you. Who you were, where you belonged, what mattered, and what did not. You could resist those answers later. You could reject them, but you did not have to invent alternatives from nothing. That distinction mattered more than we realized. Meaning as inheritance. In earlier eras, meaning functioned less like belief and more like infrastructure. It was embedded in social arrangements, moral codes, professional identities, religious narratives, and national myths. These systems were imperfect and often cruel, but they performed a critical function. They coordinated people across time. A farmer did not need to solve the purpose of existence before planting crops. A parent did not need to invent a personal philosophy to justify sacrifice. A laborer did not need to interrogate the value of work every morning. Meaning was assumed, not debated. Life unfolded inside a frame that had already decided which struggles were honorable, which losses were acceptable, and which hopes were realistic. This did not make people wise. It made them oriented. The modern mistake is to confuse orientation with truth. Meaning systems were rarely accurate in any philosophical sense. They distorted reality, excluded voices, and preserved power. But accuracy was not their primary function. Coordination was. The function of shared stories. Every society relies on shared stories to survive. These stories do not need to be factual. They need to be mutually legible. They need to give people a way to interpret events without starting from zero each time something goes wrong. When a war broke out, there were narratives for sacrifice and loss. When famine struck, there were stories about endurance and providence. When injustice persisted, there were explanations, excuses, or promises deferred to another generation or another world. These stories did not eliminate suffering. They prevented suffering from becoming incomprehensible. Incomprehensible suffering is far more destabilizing than suffering itself. When pain has a place to land, people can endure extraordinary hardship. When it does not, even minor instability can feel unbearable. Institutions once existed to slow the world down. Education did not simply transmit information. It transmitted interpretive norms. It taught people how to think about events, not just what had happened. History arrived as narrative, not as raw data. Context preceded reaction. Religion, for all its abuses, provided temporal relief. It allowed certain questions to remain unanswered without demanding immediate resolution. Suffering could be deferred, reframed, or sanctified. Meaning did not have to be finalized in a single lifetime. Journalism operated under similar constraints. News arrived on schedules. Editors acted as filters. Events were selected, contextualized, and sequenced. The pace of information allowed time for digestion. There was room for silence between updates. Politics, too, moved slowly enough for identity to stabilize around it. Ideologies were durable. Even conflict followed recognizable patterns. People could orient themselves without constantly recalibrating who they were in response to each new development. None of this was neutral. All of it was shaped by power. But power itself was legible. It had names, locations, and predictable behaviors. Even opposition could organize because the terrain was stable. Cultural memory as buffer. Cultures once carried memory the way bodies carry immunity. Past collapses left behind stories. Past failures produced rituals. Not every crisis was unprecedented. Not every disaster required reinvention. Memory reduced panic. It gave people templates for response. When economies failed, there were known patterns of survival. When leaders betrayed trust, there were inherited skepticisms. When injustice endured, there were movements that remembered how long change could take. This memory did not guarantee justice. It guaranteed continuity. Continuity matters more to the human psyche than we like to admit. A world that is unfair but predictable is often easier to survive than one that claims fairness but behaves chaotically. Meaning systems provided predictability, even when they did so dishonestly. The invisibility of stability. Because meaning was ambient, it was easy to mistake it for permanence. People began to believe that coherence was natural rather than maintained, that shared narratives would always exist, that institutions would always absorb complexity, that someone, somewhere, was handling the contradictions of the world. This illusion made critique possible. You can only dismantle a structure when it is strong enough to withstand dismantling. Deconstruction flourishes in stable environments. Skepticism assumes a ground that does not immediately collapse beneath it. Over time, it became fashionable to say that meaning was arbitrary, constructed, illusory. In one sense, this was true. In another, it misunderstood function. A bridge does not cease to matter because it was designed. A structure does not lose its value because it could have been built differently. Meaning systems did not need to be eternal. They only needed to hold long enough for lives to unfold. The uneven cost. None of this should be romanticized. Stability was purchased unevenly. Many people were excluded from the protections meaning provided. Entire populations were sacrificed so that coherence could be maintained for others. Traditions preserved power as often as they preserved wisdom. Institutions protected themselves before they protected the vulnerable. But even this injustice had a grim internal logic. The system knew who it was failing. The lies were at least consistent. What mattered psychologically was not fairness, but containment. Containment allowed people to plan, to endure, to delay despair. It kept existential panic from becoming a daily burden. Meaning was not comfort, it was containment. What meaning was carrying? For most of human history, meaning carried weight that individuals never had to feel directly. It carried the question of purpose. It carried the terror of uncertainty. It carried the contradiction between hope and reality. It carried the awareness of mortality without demanding constant attention. When contradictions arose, they were routed outward to slow-moving systems. People argued, protested, prayed, voted, waited. They did not have to resolve everything internally, immediately, and alone. Meaning absorbed tension before it reached the nervous system. That was its quiet, unspoken function. The unnoticed shift. When systems like this fail, they do not collapse all at once. They erode. They stop slowing things down. They stop filtering. They stop buffering contradiction. At first, nothing seems wrong. Information increases. Choice expands. Authority weakens. Freedom appears to grow. People celebrate the loosening of old constraints without noticing what those constraints were holding back. The loss does not announce itself as loss. It feels like acceleration. It feels like openness. It feels like possibility. Only later does the weight become noticeable. And when it does, it is no longer sitting where it used to. It has moved. Chapter 2. Meaning as structure. Meaning is often spoken of as belief. This language misleads more than it clarifies. Beliefs are private. They can be held, discarded, revised, or ignored. Meaning, as it functioned for most of human history, was not optional in this way. It was not something people carried internally so much as something they lived inside. It shaped behavior before it shaped thought. It constrained action before it inspired reflection. Meaning was structural. This distinction matters because structures do work whether or not the people inside them consciously endorse them. A person may dislike a role and still perform it. A society may doubt a myth and still organize around it. Meaning did not require constant agreement to remain effective. It required participation. Meaning as coordination technology. The primary function of meaning was not to explain the world accurately. It was to coordinate people reliably. Human societies scale only when large numbers of individuals can predict one another's behavior well enough to act collectively. Meaning systems provided this predictability. They reduced ambiguity. They narrowed interpretation. They established shared expectations about what counted as normal, acceptable, admirable, or shameful. This coordination did not depend on consensus. People disagreed fiercely about details while still operating inside the same frame. A shared frame defines the kinds of disagreements that are possible without threatening the whole. It sets the outer boundary of sense-making. Inside a frame, conflict can be absorbed. Outside it, conflict becomes existential. Meaning systems defined those boundaries. They answered questions most people did not have the time, energy, or safety to renegotiate every day. What is a good life? What counts as failure? When suffering is meaningful and when it is not? What obligations persist even when desire disappears? These answers were often unjust. They were rarely kind, but they were stable. Stability allowed societies to function across generations. Roles before identity. Before identity became something to be discovered or expressed, roles came first. Roles were not reflections of inner truth. They were social contracts. They told people how to behave when inner truth was unclear, conflicted, or inaccessible. A role answers questions identity cannot reliably answer under stress. What do I do when I feel empty? How do I act when I doubt myself? What is required of me when motivation fails? You performed the role because it was yours. You endured because endurance was expected. You showed up because absence had consequences. This did not guarantee fulfillment. It guaranteed continuity. Modern culture often treats continuity as a lesser goal than authenticity. Historically, continuity was the precondition for everything else. A society that cannot rely on people to perform necessary roles collapses long before it can optimize for personal expression. Roles reduced decision load. They allowed people to function without constant self-interrogation. They provided external structure when internal clarity was unavailable. When roles weaken without replacement, individuals are forced to improvise constantly. Improvisation initially feels like freedom. Over time, it becomes exhausting. Ritual as regulation. Ritual is frequently dismissed as superstition or empty repetition. In practice, ritual served a regulatory function that modern societies have struggled to replace. Ritual marked time. It separated phases of life. It created predictable emotional rhythms in an otherwise unstable world. Birth, coming of age, marriage, labor, rest, mourning, death. These transitions were not left to individual interpretation. They were named, structured, and shared. Ritual localized emotion. Grief had a place to go. Celebration had boundaries. Fear was acknowledged without being allowed to dominate daily function. Ritual gave people permission to feel deeply without requiring those feelings to persist indefinitely. Without ritual, emotion spills everywhere. When grief is not contained, it becomes ambient. When celebration has no structure, it becomes compulsive. When fear has no designated outlet, it leaks into every decision. Ritual did not eliminate pain. It prevented pain from dissolving the entire field of meaning. Myth as compression. Myths were not believed because they were literally true. They were believed because they compressed complexity into something portable. A myth allows a society to store moral and existential knowledge without requiring each generation to rediscover it independently. It creates recognizable patterns: the hero, the traitor, the martyr, the exile. These figures were not psychological insights. They were behavioral templates. Templates reduce cognitive load. When people encounter situations that resemble known stories, they can orient themselves quickly. They do not need to analyze from first principles. They recognize the shape of the moment. This recognition is stabilizing. When every event is treated as unprecedented, meaning production becomes exhausting. Myth prevented that exhaustion by recycling narrative forms. Even when the analogy was imperfect, it provided a foothold. Modern cultures tend to undervalue this function because they mistake narrative reuse for intellectual laziness. In reality, it was a survival strategy. Institutions as structural memory. Institutions functioned as memory devices. They stored decisions made long before current participants arrived. Laws, customs, doctrines, and procedures prevented societies from relitigating every moral and practical question continuously. This slowed volatility. A legal system does not need to be just to be stabilizing. It needs to be predictable. An educational system does not need to be innovative to orient people. It needs to be legible. A religious system does not need to be true to provide containment. It needs to be consistent. Consistency allows planning. Planning allows endurance. When institutions lose consistency, individuals are forced into constant recalibration. Every decision becomes a referendum on values. Every action requires justification. This level of cognitive demand does not scale. Authority as filtering. Authority is commonly framed only as control. Historically, it also functioned as filtration. Authority narrowed the range of interpretation. It determined which voices mattered and which could be ignored. This reduced noise. It also enforced hierarchy and exclusion. Both effects existed simultaneously. Filtering is not inherently censorship. It is triage. Not every claim requires evaluation. Not every event demands reaction. Not every voice must be heard for a system to function. Meaning systems filtered reality to keep it metabolizable. When authority collapses without replacement, filtration does not disappear. It is outsourced. Volume replaces judgment. Popularity replaces legitimacy. Urgency replaces deliberation. Noise fills the gap. Structure versus truth. Truth is expensive. It requires constant updating, verification, and revision. Structure amortizes that cost across time. It allows people to function without constantly re-evaluating their position in the world. A structure can hold falsehood and still stabilize behavior. Truth without structure destabilizes everything at once. This is why societies historically resisted certain truths. Not because people were foolish, but because coherence was necessary for survival. A system that cannot coordinate collapses long before it can correct itself. Meaning systems prioritized continuity over correction. That trade-off produced injustice. It also produced survivability. The cost of dismantling without replacement. As older meaning structures weakened, they were criticized for their failures. Many of those critiques were justified. Roles were restrictive, authority was abused, myths excluded and erased. What was not replaced was the structural function those systems performed. Stories were dismantled without rebuilding containment. Roles dissolved without replacing orientation. Authority weakened without installing new filters. Information accelerated without preserving integration. What remained was exposure. Exposure to contradiction. Exposure to suffering. Exposure to choice without guidance. Initially, this exposure felt like liberation. Constraints fell away. Voices multiplied. Possibility expanded. Only later did the cost become apparent. Structure is not optional. The central mistake was believing that meaning could be removed without consequence, that individuals could carry what institutions once held, that everyone could become their own sense-making engine. This assumption ignored scale. No individual can metabolize the full complexity of modern life without structure. No nervous system can remain regulated while processing constant contradiction without buffering. No society can survive long-term without shared frames that slow reality down. Meaning was never just a story people told themselves. It was architecture. And when architecture weakens, people do not immediately feel the collapse. They feel openness, light, freedom to move. They step forward. Only later do they realize the floor is no longer solid.